Hello, everybody, and welcome to another day of learning. So, as always, we're just going to sort of pick up where we left off last time. And this week, we actually have a number of different topics that we need to cover, need to look at. These would cover things like reform movements during what we call the antebellum period, that is the period prior to the Civil War. There were a number of reform movements, including reforms in education, reforms in prisons, reforms in asylums, health reforms. If you've ever had a graham cracker, right, that was created by Sylvester Graham. And I heard from a colleague or a historian of mine once that partially the reason that was created was to help stave people off from masturbating. I don't know how accurate that is, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. But there were also some very prominent reform movements during this time, and that would include things like the women's rights movement, abolitionism, and the temperance movement. And so we're going to try to go through at least three of those movements, women's rights, temperance, and abolitionism, this week. In fact, many of these reform movements were motivated by a religious awakening known as the Second Great Awakening. That occurred really in the early portion of the 1800s, and it really focused less on God's calling you and making a decision for your salvation, and it really focused on what you could do. As one would argue that it moved away from notions of Calvinism more towards Arminianism, the idea that you can choose your salvation. And really one of the things that the Second Great Awakening helps to contribute to is this idea of perfectionism, that if society could just be made perfect, if humanity could get rid of the sins of the world, then we could create a moment where Christ himself could come back down to earth for his millennial reign. In fact, there were some folks who believed that humanity could get to a point where they were no longer capable of sinning. And this, of course, is an idea that was very contrary to more puritanical views of worship. Lots of different associations and organizations were created during this time period. Temperance organizations, anti-slavery organizations, abolitionist organizations, among others. And so we're going to be talking about some of those. We're also going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution and the Market Revolution. And by the way, all of these things are happening all at the same time. And so the reason why I sort of lump all these sort of different topics together is because it's all going on at the same time. And so there's no easy way to sort of tell these stories, but to sort of understand it's all going on at the same time. But you also see the Industrial Revolution going on and the Market Revolution taking place. Much of the Industrial Revolution is going on in the northern portion of the country, and what you're going to see there is the development of new factories, particularly a factory that sort of set the stage for other factories was one built in Lowell, Massachusetts. Early factories were built along riverbanks and where waterways were, and the reason for that is because they needed a water wheel in order to make all the machinery move. Obviously, as steam power and then eventually electricity was applied, you could move your factories away from areas where the water was. But early examples would have been Lowell's factory. Lowell tended to focus his energies on hiring women to work in his factories. They became known as Lowell Girls. Interestingly enough, and these are really amazing women, they were the very first labor union in the United States. They did not like the working conditions and the pay that they found themselves under. And so they struck for better wages. Eventually, these women will be replaced with immigrants, predominantly Irish immigrants. But nonetheless, the Industrial Revolution helps to bring the United States into the textile industry. That is, they're going to be making clothing. And thanks to innovations like the railroad and the canals, you're also going to see a market revolution. In fact, you're still impacted by the market revolution and the industrial revolution to this very day. For example, time zones exist because of the railroad as they attempted to standardize things. The market revolution, the industrial revolution contributed to changes in work patterns, in the way in which we respond and interact and have relationships with labor and work. Prior to the industrial revolution, much of the work that was done in manufacturing was done in something called the domestic system or the home system. That is where you would have a skilled craftsperson make particular items in their home on their own terms, and they would be handmade. By contrast, the Industrial Revolution created a work situation where you would go to work, where you did not own the means of production, right? So when I go to work, I do not own the computers and the desks and the buildings. I simply use those things, and I'm supposed to show up from time A to time B and be productive during that time. And so the relationship between work and workers themselves changes. The need for skilled laborers becomes less necessary as machines are invented to replace the need for certain labor. So we're going to be talking about that this week. But we're also going to be talking about slavery. We're going to be talking about the slave trade. We're going to be talking about race theory. And I really am interested in that particular topic, and I want to share with you a couple of books that I've been reading. Not that you necessarily have to read them or would read them, but just interesting thoughts. And so I want to spend a little bit more time talking about that in this lecture. And hopefully, we can get back to the antebellum reforms here in a little bit. But one of the things we need to understand about slavery in the United States is that it was different than other forms of slavery. I mean, slavery is not brand new. Slavery is an institution that's been around almost since the beginning of time, right? But one of the things that makes slavery so unique in the United States is that it became predicated upon the forced and coerced labor of a particular group of people. And predominantly, we're talking about West Africans, and then ultimately African Americans. This system of labor comes to be referred to as chattel slavery, that the slaves themselves are not viewed by slave masters as being people, that they are no better than your chattel, right? I mean, one of the arguments that many Southerners gave for fighting against the potential restriction of expanding slavery into the new Western territories is that you could no more restrict a man from bringing his pig with him than you could bringing his slave with him. And I know that that sounds harsh, and it is, and it was, right? I mean, one of the things that's true about slavery is that just when you think it couldn't have been that bad, we come to recognize, oh, it was much, much worse. But slaves were not viewed necessarily as people. Slaves could be raped, beaten, and murdered without any type of punishment enacted against those individuals who enacted that. I mean, we even think of someone like Thomas Jefferson, who in some ways, I don't want to say he was ambivalent about the institution of slavery. The man had slaves. He never saw fit to free his slaves. But one of the differences between someone like Thomas Jefferson and someone like John C. Calhoun is that Thomas Jefferson viewed slavery as a necessary evil, right? By contrast, someone like John C. Calhoun, who was at one point vice president of the United States, he became a senator from South Carolina. John C. Calhoun would say that slavery is not a necessary evil, but rather it is a positive good. In fact, many slaveholders came to believe that the institution of slavery was a civilizing institution. They believed that slaves benefited from the institution of slavery. They believed that slaves benefited because they were around these white, benevolent, patriarchal type fathers. I mean, one of the arguments that is made by slaveholders during the Industrial Revolution is slaveholders will look at northern factories and they will look at northern capitalists. And what slave owners will say is, if you take a look at these northern factory owners, there is slavery up there. Right? You abolitionists, you anti-slavery folks, and I'll explain the difference between those two things here in a second. But you folks who want to criticize slavery here in the South, you've got slavery up there in the North. You don't pay your people well, right? There's no Christian benevolence going on there. You don't care about your workers. When they get sick, you're not there to take care of them. And then what these white slave owners would then have the audacity to say is, but by contrast, we love our slaves. We care for our slaves in their old age. If it wasn't for us, they wouldn't have food on their table. Okay, but that's the type of thinking that begins to develop in the South. In fact, there are many justifications that Southerners will give to justify the institution of slavery. And I want to share to you a book that I've read. It's called Stamped from the Beginning. It is an amazing text. It's called The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And you can see I really got into the text here. But in this book, the author, Ibram Kendi, really gets into the idea that racist ideas and racist theories not only persisted, but changed and altered to meet the needs and the demands of the people, all the way up into the present day. It is a bit of a hefty read, but it's worth looking at because the reality is that these racial theories oftentimes were used as justifications to not only maintain the institution of slavery, but to maintain white supremacy. And we have to understand that during this time, when the Industrial Revolution is going on, when you have abolitionism going on as a reform movement, it is very easy to begin to think about the United States in what we call a binary, right? That is, in the North, you have folks who hate slavery and they want it to go away and they don't benefit from it. And by contrast, you've got these cold, harsh, nasty Southerners who only want to see slavery further into the future. And that binary isn't entirely true. One of the things that was very true about the Industrial Revolution is that industrialists benefited from the institution of slavery. Northern factories got their cotton from the slaves from the South. Northern banks gave loans to slave plantation owners in order for cotton to be able to be purchased, right? Northern merchants shipped out the cotton that was being produced. And so the North, in many ways, benefited from the institution of slavery. And so this actually complicates the discussion about what caused the Civil War, because oftentimes we talk about the Civil War as being caused by Northern abolitionists who wanted to fight against slavery in the South, right? But the truth is that if certain Northerners benefited from the institution of slavery, why on earth would they wage war against it? Now, that's not to say that everyone in the North was for slavery, but even people who were not in favor of slavery weren't necessarily not racist. And this is where we begin to see a distinction between the term anti-slavery and abolitionist. An abolitionist, when we talk about some of these reformers, people like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, these were abolitionists. These were folks who wanted to see slavery done away with and gone, right? Immediately, as William Lloyd Garrison would say. Although I will argue that William Lloyd Garrison was not necessarily someone who then thought that blacks and whites should have social equality with one another. In fact, Ibram Kendi makes that point in his text. But abolitionists were ones who would say, hey, yeah, we need to get rid of slavery, it needs to be gone now. Anti-slavery people were different. Anti-slavery folks were individuals who were okay with slavery where it already existed, but they did not want to see slavery extend into the new Western territories. So they wanted to limit slavery's expansion. Abraham Lincoln would be an anti-slavery individual. Lincoln was not a fan of slavery, but he was willing to tolerate it where it existed. In fact, when we get to the Civil War, time and time again, he will say from his own mouth that he would tolerate slavery where it existed, but he didn't want to see it expand. Now, you have a number of reasons why you may not want to see slavery expand. Maybe you have a moral outrage against it. But more often than not, many people in the North who were anti-slavery opposed having slavery expand because they were poor farmers and they could not compete with the institution of slavery. Think of it like this. If you own a mom and pop shop and then a Walmart comes drop down next to you, you're going to go out of business. That's what would happen. If you're a small farmer and then a massive plantation with slaves on it comes next door to you, it's going to put you out of business. In fact, the Lincoln family, Thomas Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln, were forced out of Kentucky because they couldn't compete with the institution of slavery. And I have a feeling that's one of the reasons why Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery. But folks did benefit from this institution in the North. Make no qualms about it. There's this fantastic book called How the Other Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist, or This Half Has Never Been Told, something to that effect. And he talks about how American capitalism rests on the backs of slaves. And the lives of slaves were rough. They were torturous. They were brought over here forcefully. They are forced immigrants. And they were brought over here on a transatlantic journey known as the slave trade. And they came in on slave ships, which were absolutely horrific. There are many examples of massively inhumane things done to people, right? I mean, you can think about the Holocaust, you can think about any type of mass genocide. But you read accounts of how slaves were shipped across on these slave ships during a process known as the Middle Passage, and it's horrifying. The number of people who embarked onto the ship and then disembarked was never the same. People died. People jumped off the sides of the ship because they didn't want to live lives that they presumed was going to come. And once they arrived, they could be branded. They were bought. They were auctioned. Eventually, in 1808, the United States abolishes the slave trade. That means we were no longer going to bring slaves into the country from the slave trade. But we would continue to have slaves grow. In fact, on the eve of the Civil War, there are 4 million slaves in the United States, and that's because they were bred. And that's a horrifying thing to have to say, but it's true. And the reality is that the racial theories, the need for labor, is not going to go away following the Civil War. The conditions of African Americans in the South and in other parts of the country, but predominantly the South, are oftentimes just as dire, and it's a sad, tragic story. Other texts, if you're interested in reading about race theory and being an anti-racist, would be, here you got this one by David Roediger, How Race Survived History. You've got this other book, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's also by Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's a good book. Just finishing up this one, it's called The Color of Compromise. This actually talks about religion and the Christian church in the United States. And then just because it's an awesome read, this one here, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity, A World Made for Whiteness, Austin Channing Brown. So if you're interested in this discussion of whiteness and race theory and slavery, and even one of the most popular forms of mass culture, which was blackface minstrelsy, I'd love to talk with you more and more about that. So we could definitely get into that in a Zoom meeting if anyone's interested in diving more into that. But we're going to be talking about that issue. Just sort of getting back to the antebellum reform, we're also going to be talking about the temperance movement and the women's rights movement. Just so you're aware, women spearheaded both of these movements in major ways. Oftentimes, women were on the forefronts of the abolitionist movement. And by the way, not everyone in the South was pro-slavery. You think of people like Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They came from a slave-holding family in the South, but yet they became very much abolitionists. Oftentimes, women were on the forefront of the abolitionist movement, but because women were relegated to a lower social system strata than men were, oftentimes women began to see themselves as occupying a position of slavery to their husbands, to men, that men had placed them in a subservient place. And so out of the abolitionist movement comes the women's rights movement. You'll also see women kind of spearhead the temperance movement, and the temperance movement is sort of the forerunner for the prohibition movement, which obviously came in the early 1900s. But there was an increasing number of folks who were getting drunk, and as industrialization continued, it became very, very dangerous for people to drink on the job. I mean, when you're working at home producing your own goods and you're working on your own time, you can be a little tipsy. But when you go to work and you're working with new machines that will cut digits off, you can't be drinking, and people were drinking whiskey. And so all of a sudden, you've got these men who are spending all the money at the saloons on drinks and on prostitutes and now gambling and everything else, and they come home and they're beating their wives, they're raping their wives, which, by the way, there was no legal recourse for marital rape not until the late 1980s is when you see mechanisms put in place for women to be able to sue their husbands for marital rape, right? I mean, that's insane, that's crazy. But the temperance movement is there as a way to help regulate the morality of others in terms of drinking. If we can get rid of drinking, then we can get rid of prostitution. We can get rid of crime. We can get rid of men spending all their money, right? That sort of thing. So that's what we're going to be looking at. I know that I covered a lot of that very, very quickly, and I didn't even get that too deep into some of this content. But again, I don't want to do a 2-hour-long video here. And I don't think you want to watch a 2-hour-long video. So that's broadly what we're going to be talking about this week. So as always, if you have questions or comments, let me know. We can digest this more fully if you'd like. And if you're interested in the topic of whiteness and race theory and slavery and blackface minstrelsy and all of that, civil rights movements, contact me. I've got a lot of things that you can read and videos that you can watch. So that's where I'm at. Everybody, I hope you will find this week's information interesting. So until next time, go in peace, be warm and filled, may the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, everybody.